Welcome to this episode of ECPG Live. The topic today is on cannabis, gaming, and gambling. Before I welcome our guests, first, let me remind everyone that this is streaming live to both Facebook and YouTube. You are welcome, if you're tuning in live, to leave comments for us. We'll keep an eye on those, and you may see them appear on screen. Also, please remember that Facebook and YouTube are not confidential platforms. So please only share what is yours and what is comfortable. And as always, we have a blog post for this episode with some links and resources on this subject on it already for you. We may add some more after the show. We'll see. So, with that, and my name is Tana Russell. I am Assistant Director at the Evergreen Council on Problem Gambling. That might help. I'd like to bring on our guests today. I've been excited for this episode for quite some time because I've had it in the back of my mind, and y'all's names have been on a little planning sheet in our files for some time for this. So thank you for being here. We've got Dr. Hilarie Cash with Restart Life. It is a treatment center for video gaming disorder, internet tech addictions, and a number of other co-occurring issues. And Dr. Timothy Fong with UCLA's Gambling Studies Program and Center for Cannabis and Cannabinoids. Thank you both for being here.
It's a pleasure.
Now, while you both have been on our live streams before, if you don't mind, tell our viewers a little bit more about yourselves and your work related to our topic today.
Well, I'll jump in. Yeah. So I am co-founder of Restart Life, which is a residential treatment program, as Tana was mentioning. And I've been really specializing in the whole area of internet addiction since the mid-90s. I had a residential, before starting the residential treatment program, had started an outpatient program called Internet and Computer Addiction Services back in '99. So I've been doing this a long time. And yeah, that's I suppose the only thing people need to know. How about you guys?
They'll learn more as we go.
Hilarie, you're so modest. Restart is absolutely one of the pioneers of the work exploring the relationship between video game, internet gaming, and the influence between the body, brain, and mind. So you're really doing wonderful work.
Thank you.
My name is Dr. Timothy Fong. I'm a professor of psychiatry at UCLA here in Los Angeles. By trade, I'm a addiction psychiatrist, but I've been part of our UCLA Gambling Studies program since the very beginning in 2005, where we've been interested in understanding gambling behavior, gambling addiction, gambling, social gambling, recreational gambling, gambling's impact on the body, brain, and mind. In 2016, as our state of California regulated and approved adult use of marijuana, it became very clear that we also needed to have an academic response. And that's how we developed our UCLA Center for Cannabis and Cannabinoids. You can see it there. A center designed to look at the therapeutic potential of cannabis, as well as to reduce and minimize the harmful effects of cannabis. And so oftentimes people say, wait a minute, you study gambling and you study cannabis, the two aren't related. And originally we thought, no, they're not. In fact, our hallways were separate. Now we realize they very much are related. And this is wonderful that we can bring it together about some of the ideas that we have, how they are related, and what's important over the next 5 or 10 years for us to be addressing.
Excellent. Thank you. So, of course, we do a lot of treatment training and awareness on problem gambling and gaming. But today, our common denominator between the two is cannabis. So let's start off chatting about that one for just a second. What makes cannabis unique from other substances and substance disorders?
Dr. Fong, you should address this one.
Well, thank you. I want to hear your opinion there, of course. So again, number one, cannabis is unique. Number one, all other substances, many other substances of abuse and misuse come from the ground, just like cannabis. Opioids, cocaine, nicotine, caffeine. what makes it unique is where we think, how the public thinks about cannabis. So right now, our federal government says cannabis is still a Schedule I substance, meaning no medicinal value, only abuse potential. So that puts a block on academic research and study. At the same time, we've had now almost 35 years of experience with cannabis as medicine in the form of medical marijuana laws, practitioners, lived experience, human experiences where people say, when I used cannabis, my life got better. So this is where it's both much more so than a lot of other substances, a compound that has a plant that has medicinal value as well as potential abuse liability. Cannabis, we have to remember, is a plant that has well over 100 different kinds of compounds and chemicals called cannabinoids. That's why we're the Center for Cannabis and Cannabinoids. Cannabis is the plant. The cannabinoids are the substances in the cannabis plant that are responsible for all the impact on body, brain, and mind. The number one cannabinoid everyone knows about, of course, Hilarie, is?
Well, which one are you referring to?
THC. That's the number one cannabinoid. The number two that now everyone knows about is CBD. But there's all these other ones, CBG, CBL, Delta TH9, all these different ones. So the unique parts for me that cannabis can do a lot of amazing things, both to the good and potentially to the bad. And we've created a culture that really celebrates and promotes it, combined with a lot of folks who still are really afraid of it. There's so much myth. I'll give you one myth, and I'll let Hilarie add in. A lot of people say you can't die from cannabis overdose. You can't die from cannabis. Well, that's false. You can become intoxicated on cannabis and get into a car accident and die, or develop a state of psychosis and end up falling from a roof or shooting somebody or getting shot. You may not die from a physical overdose like you would from heroin or fentanyl, but you can certainly incur very permanent and deadly consequences just from a single use. But lots of other stuff. Hilarie, what are some of your thoughts?
Well, what I've mostly noticed, and I think what bothers me and worries me the most, is just the myth around marijuana, that it is not addictive, that it doesn't have addictive potential. There's really nothing but good about it. And that's a myth from when I was young and smoking weed and getting actually pretty addicted to it in my early 20s. And that was the stuff that was really mild in comparison to what's being grown and used today. And for that myth to hold over for so many years is the thing that I think worries me the most about it. And when I talk to the gamers and gamblers that come to Restart, these are people who almost always they cling to that myth, and they fail to recognize how addicted some of them have become to the substance.
That's so, and for so many people out there, constantly the last few years, we've been talking about that. So THC concentration in the 1980s on most cannabis that were seized by the federal government was around 4%. That number is now 16%. But we have other new products that were never invented over the last 10 years ago. So that's where you hear these things like oils and dabs and wax and shatter. These are high concentrated products. They contain upwards of 70, 80, 90% THC. But our brain is the same as it was in 1960s and 70s. So what's different is what we're putting into our bodies, and how our bodies react is very, very different. We know that cannabis has about a 9% chance of developing addiction from the very, very first time you ingest. Now, that might not sound like a lot, but we know for cocaine and nicotine, that's like 20%, 25%. But Hilarie, the first time you ever take kale or a quinoa salad, what's the likelihood that you would develop addiction? It's not 9%.
No.
So when people say, oh my gosh, it's not as addicting as other substances, that may be true. But 9 out of 100 young people that start today are going to develop a pretty significant addiction just a few months from now. I think that's a pretty big number. And that's why our messaging, and we'll jump right to the end, is delay the very first use of cannabis until after your brain is fully grown.
Right.
And then even when you start using, not to use it on a daily basis. The greatest risk factor for young people developing addiction is early introduction combined with frequent use. That's what creates addiction.
Thank you. You just made me remember something. I heard a medical director, he's retired now, but talk about in his lifetime career in hospitals, there used to almost never be hospitalizations due to cannabis-induced states. But over the years, leading up to the last few decades before his retirement, he said now it's a common occurrence that people are hospitalized. Some of the reasons you named earlier, and some are others like psychosis and whatnot. So it's really interesting. Yeah, it's not the same drug as the 60s anymore.
I want to ask Hilarie right away. You've been working with gamers since the 90s. How many in the 90s were using cannabis concurrently versus now?
Oh, very few compared to now. We have seen a huge increase in more recent years. I think after the legalization of it, we've seen a huge increase. And also what we've seen is that, as the cannabis products, the cannabinoid products become more and more intense, we're seeing people who come into us really with some pretty significant addiction to it. Yeah. So it's changed a lot just over the last 20 years.
Dr. Fong, I'm hoping you might be able to give us a quick explanation between the difference of medical marijuana, traditional medicine, someone self-medicating with it, or just wanting to get high.
So that's a whole career in of itself, but I think it's important to get some clarity. So we start with terms. Marijuana is a generic term for the cannabis plant. Marijuana is a term that has a lot of interesting connotations to it, both politically, economically, there's discrimination, racism, and all that. But when we think of marijuana, scientifically, we mean the cannabis plant. When I use the term hemp, hemp is a type of cannabis plant that has less than 0.3% THC in that. The cannabis plant, as we tend to think about it, is any cannabis plant that has more than 0.3% THC inside the plant itself. And again, you have wide varieties of cannabis plant. That's why you hear about different strains like sativa or indica and all that sort of thing. Then we have synthetic cannabis or synthetic marijuana, which is not at all derived by any plants. It's all chemicals. And that's, of course, spice and K2 and things like that. We're not going to talk about that here today. But for many years now, over the 35 years, many states have now legalized and allowed physicians like myself to say, if I believe a patient could benefit by using cannabis, that I now will allow and make a recommendation. In no state in America is that a prescription. One of the things that a lot of people get misunderstood is that a doctor would actually evaluate you, write a prescription for you, and give you the prescription, and you go to the dispensary. It's not like that at all. So the whole concept of using cannabis as medicine, I think, has really, been, not as well handled as I'd like to see. For instance, doctors aren't trained. Doctors don't get, best practices. Many states, you can go get a, quote, medical marijuana card by a doctor and never go back to that doctor. So if we're going to use it as medicine, shouldn't it be done as a medicine, which means I'm going to see my doctor regularly to evaluate for effectiveness and side effects? Is there any medicine that we ever smoke? I mean, there's no other medicine I'm aware of that you tell people to smoke, which is why if you're going to use cannabis as medicine, it needs to be in a standardized form. It needs to be, in a product that is easily digestible and, like an edible. So there's a lot of variants, which is why there's so much confusion. So as it stands right now, again, my general opinion is there are medical conditions in which cannabis can be very, very useful for. But the problem is not nearly as effective for as much for things as people think. Everyone thinks it helps what? Sleep, mood, pain, anxiety, depression, all that. Some of it's true, some of it's not. So it's a really confusing world. But short of it right now, I think is we have a lot more work to do as physicians to be better at using cannabis as medicine rather than what we currently have, which is it's a very vague and amorphous and strange world where you're not getting good clinical guidance on how to use cannabis for a medical condition.
And then, of course, when it comes to self-medicating, as a general population, we're quite good at this, whether it's self-medicating with a tub of ice cream or with something we can drink or smoke or numb out in front of. Let's talk about now this connection with cannabis and playing a video game or playing a gambling game. Dr. Cash, let's start with you. In your career, working primarily with people with these gaming and internet-based addictions, you said early on you had very few using cannabis and it's significantly increased. What do you see as the connection here? Why do you think
availability?
Yeah.
I mean, I think availability and just it's like it's becoming a social norm within the gaming community. So the online communities of gamers are talking to each other, sharing stories, making recommendations of good websites where you can go and get, various kinds of products that contain cannabis, from the cannabis plant. And so I really see it as having become a social norm within the gaming community. And that's a big, big difference. So you've got young kids playing these games with adults, and they're listening to the conversation and participating in the conversation, and they want to be cool, and they want to be like the older folks that they're playing games with. And those older folks are talking about weed and where they can go get the best stuff, and what are the online websites where they're selling this, and that what are they recommending? Of course, you're a kid participating in that. There is nothing more desirable in your own mind than to fit in with these cool dudes that you're playing video games with. And so I just think it's now become quite a social norm.
Mm. And Dr. Fong, you said a minute ago that when your programs there first started, you were on opposite side of the halls. You didn't think they'd be much related, and now you are seeing the relationship. So what is it that changed your mind, or what is it that you're seeing connects them?
So when we started the gambling studies program, we knew about the very clear co-occurring other stuff, alcohol and tobacco. That kind of ran clearly with gambling, right? Casinos promoted it. The gamblers themselves talked about it. They had lots of high co-occurring things, but they didn't have high co-occurring rates of gambling or cannabis use. As Hilarie mentioned, again, you look at the trends. Cannabis went from a counterculture, underground activity to an above ground corporate popular culture combined with a lot of the forces of celebrity, of music, sports, of art, and from counterculture to cool culture. At the same time, in the gambling world, it's been similar, where you don't see, for instance, gambling industries partnering with cannabis companies just yet, right? We don't see that. But we see alcohol and gambling still very much part of that association. We're starting to see that merging where, again, it'll happen. So one of the things that we look at is, will we see a day that a casino, let's say in Washington or California, will have cannabis inside the casino actively being promoted, being allowed to be consumed, being sold on its premise? Right now, it's not, because of the federal government's Controlled Substance Act. A casino can't do that because that would be violating federal law. I think once that law is removed, you'll see again the association will blend itself together. And it's kind of like, steak and lobster, that complement each other. People have for years said gambling and smoking. Why? Oh, to help, quell the nerves and anxiety of gambling, to heighten your sensation of gambling. And I think in time, we're going to start seeing that bonding between gambling and cannabis, the idea that cannabis can make your gambling experience more interesting. It just can make your gambling better. I mean, all the things that we see with alcohol, tobacco, and gambling, I think we'll see ultimately with cannabis once it's all open and legalized. But the other burning questions are really things like, does cannabis make people gamble more? Does gambling make people want to use more cannabis? Does cannabis create people with more gambling disorder, or vice versa? Those are the questions that are unanswered. But just that association is new. And if I'll show something really quick here, where we're beginning to see this association is this. And I'll show this tab here that I have where we're looking at this. And this is really where that blending. So this is from Google Play, an example of a downloadable app you can get on Google Play today. Marijuana Casino, Lucky Weed Smokers. You can see it's a slot machine simulator tying into the cannabis culture. Dankest marijuana slot. Every spin in the casino as a stoner. Get high and spin in as many free slot games. And, it's rated pretty good. Well, this person only gave it 1 star, but the idea was that that's where some of those shared experiences are starting to blend together. That's a perfect example. That's a video game.
Perfect example.
Cannabis, gambling, and it's available to the public right now. So the more we have those social norms changing, as Hilarie mentioned, the more likely we'll see a much more commonplace of using cannabis whilst gambling.
Yeah, and I think you're right. If we can make an educated guess based on the research we do have about co-occurring drug and alcohol use and gambling, we already know that alcohol and tobacco are not the only substances that tend to co-occur with gambling. I like to say alcohol might be number 1 and tobacco number 2, and meth gets an honorable mention, right? But even some of the illegal substances can co-occur in measurable rates. And I think you're right. If cannabis might be something that can be offered in casinos at some point, it probably will, right? Let's talk about the influence of cannabis while people are on it and how that might impact their decision making. So if someone is playing a gambling game or a video game and they're using or under the influence, high, etc., how might that impact their decision making, particularly when there might be money on the line?
I do think that I don't know nearly as much about the effects of cannabis as the doctor does. So I will leave it to him to really answer this. But just common sense tells me that this is going to be a problem and that it's going to be affecting the prefrontal cortex, surely, in pretty profound ways that are going to interfere with the ability of those who indulge to be making really good, sensible choices.
This is where it's fascinating because it's all over the map. So we've had a number of people who say, when I use cannabis, I'm sharper, I'm more focused, I'm less anxious. So, and some people, they say it's a performance enhancer. So think like athletes and people who it makes me better. On the flip side, again, we know, and I have a number of cases where when they're intoxicated, they not only make poor decisions, they take more risks. They become more impulsive. They become more emotional, and they actually react in ways that they wouldn't if they were intoxicated. The myth, of course, is that if you use cannabis, that you become what? Slowed, you don't care, unmotivated, that you're just relaxed and chilled out. That's a myth. If we were to give 100 people cannabis, an intoxicating dose, we're going to get 50, 60 different kind of reactions. Some people get paranoid. Some people become so talkative that you'd think they're on meth. Some people become completely disinhibited, giggly. Others fall asleep, others shut down. So that, I think, is a very valuable understanding, that it could be a wide range. And so when we work with patients, it's really important for us to recognize. For me, I don't see anyone who's intoxicated because they don't come to my office. I'm sure that's something that, Hilarie, you do when you talk to a lot of the young people, like, well, what's your relationship? How do you like to play with or without cannabis? Why do you do this? And disentangling the two, I think, is super important in therapy. But I think it just starts with this concept that it isn't always the same result. So even the same person, they can use one day, and then a week later they get a completely different experience based on what they're using, how much they're using, how much food was in their belly, all sorts of different things. So that wide range of response, I think, is really, really interesting.
One of the things that I think is worth talking about a little bit is the fusion in terms of the neural pathways of addiction. When you're somebody, even if your use of marijuana is not problematic in and of itself, you may not be addicted to it, but it is something which you use in conjunction, let's say, with playing video games or gambling. And so by association, it is very much tied to the behavior that may be, in fact, quite a problem for you.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I see with our clients is that the clients who don't understand how important it is to stay away from both if they want to stay in recovery, those are clients who will leave, and they're talking the good talk about their need. They understand they're addicted to video games, or they're addicted to porn, or they're addicted to social media, whatever it is, whatever combination it is, and they know that is a problem. But marijuana was never my problem. That was just something I did. It didn't, it helped me enjoy my gaming and being part of my gaming community. So I think I can go back to it, and I think it'll be fine. And what I see is that those individuals go back to it, and because it's so associated, tangled up with their gaming, they go back to the gaming as well, or whatever the internet activity is as well.
Right. Yeah. No,
so there's a kind of a grief process. When you're giving up an addiction, something that you've relied on as your coping mechanism, there's a grieving process to giving it up. And so now we're talking about them giving up more than they thought they were going to have to give up, and the grief that goes with that.
That's fascinating. I imagine in your residential setting, you probably get that a lot. They're like, well, why can't I use here? I mean, it's legal in Washington, and it helps me and whatnot. I was curious, have you seen cannabis withdrawal there in the residential program, where people come in and they stop, and a few days later they're irritable and they can't sleep and they're anxious, and suddenly we realize it's withdrawal?
Well, but what you need to realize is that they'll go through that just from withdrawing from gaming and their online experiences. They go through, even if they're not smoking weed or using cannabis products, they are going through withdrawal for about a month, and they are irritable, and they're not sleeping well, and they are showing classic signs of withdrawal. And when they've been smoking heavily or using heavily the cannabis products, then that is actually prolonged. What we find is that their withdrawal is often more prolonged.
Yeah, like a double withdrawal, as we say.
Yeah.
Yep.
Exactly. Yeah.
I'm really hearing you two touch on this, the convergence of these from the full spectrum: prevention, treatment, and recovery. On the prevention side, we've got, so if you compare responsible drinking messaging, safe sex messaging, safe, healthy, and how to interact with these things in a healthy way, compared to equivalent of that for video gaming, cannabis, gambling. It's just not up to par yet, right? And as you two have really pointed out, there's a lot of myths and misconceptions and a lot of emphasis on the positive or possible positives without much public education, awareness, freely accessible information on the things to be concerned about as well. So you combine that together, you've got a population of individuals who may already be at risk for developing an addiction because of something else co-occurring, genetics running in the family, other environmental factors we know can put people at risk, combined with, well, this is not going to be a problem for me, so I can use it as frequently as I want, as much as I want, and not have to worry, which can put them at risk for developing an addiction for those. And then, like you mentioned in the treatment, I like to say they piggyback on each other, right? If a person has one addiction disorder, their brain is more susceptible to developing another and another. And I've kind of seen the same in my work with substances, Hilarie, is what you were talking about. A person might be very ready to be free from one thing, but don't talk to me about this. That's not been a problem. But then they may find in that process of their treatment, recovery, and healing that one thing is holding them back, might be holding them back or prolonging the downsides, be it the withdrawal or trying to emotionally regulate it and whatnot. And that really can impact someone's long-term recovery from these things. Yeah. Let's talk real quick about youth. We're going to end with some advice and tips for youth and adults. So for youth, whether the viewers are parents or professionals who work with youth in some capacity, and I know, Dr. Cash, you work with both youth and adults at your facility. You see your fair share of co-occurring disorders all over the gamut, including these. What might be some advice you'd have for the parents on helping to give their kids the best chance possible to not end up dealing with problems from these things?
This is the million-dollar question always, is how do you help people understand the risks that their kids face, and and how to navigate that. I do think most parents, although marijuana might be the exception to this, and Dr. Fong could maybe comment on that, but I think in general parents understand that substances can interfere with good, healthy child development, therefore try to keep kids away from them. And I am curious if that attitude still holds for marijuana or not, but let's assume it does for the moment. But when it comes to video gaming and the internet activities like with social media and so forth, parents don't have that concept down at all. I mean, some parents do, but most parents, in my experience, really don't get it, that giving a smartphone to a 10-year-old is handing them a powerful and potentially highly addictive tool to be carrying around with them all the time, and how much that can interfere with healthy child development. And so getting the information out to parents about all of these things, I just don't think as a society we do a good job at all. And I think schools are one place where maybe a lot of this information could be getting across, but most schools are not doing that. And the whole idea that gambling is something which is basically now intertwined with video gaming and social media, I don't think parents have a clue about that usually. And so that we just are a long ways away from where we need to be with public education and parent education.
You said it so well. I mean, these are three different lanes, and cannabis and gambling are adult forms of entertainment and activities, 21 and over. So my message to any adult, whether healthcare providers or parents, is that it's a 21 and over activity by law. There's a reason for that. And until the laws are changed, until the science changes, we know that early use is not associated with healthy use. So that's that messaging. But parents, they're like, yeah, but how could that be that such a big deal when everyone's doing it, when it's constantly in our face, on TV, on billboards, on social media, when celebrities are endorsing it? How can it be that harmful? And I think that's number one. Parents have to recognize that it is an adult activity. Gaming, and there are some games, right, that are 21 and over, but most of them are not. I mean, same thing. That falls it under the digital entertainment space. And I usually tell parents the following. This is just my opinion, and it may be different what Hilarie says, but I don't say to parents, don't focus on how much time the kid is spending gaming or whatnot. Focus on what the kid is doing to build their brain up. Are they playing sports? Are they doing physical movement? What's their social circle like? Are they every few months doing something new? Are they able to do the adulting responsibilities we expect them to learn? Make a bed, do the laundry, prepare a meal, learn how to use a landline, how to write a one-page essay. So a lot of the parents, the messaging I say to them when they're worried, oh my God, I'm worried my kid is going to develop this addiction. I say, worry more about your kid developing the tools that prevent addiction. Right. Social skills.
I love that.
Yeah. Learning to deal with loss, learning that you are not spectacular in the sense that you are 1 in 10 million. You are imperfect. And the antidote to all addiction is connection. So I say that to all the parents, and they're oftentimes wonder, oh, aren't you going to tell me to just say no and, keep these things from patients? And I'm like, no. It's connection. Now, that's the problem, is because cannabis, gambling, and gaming, when done socially and done in moderation in a legal fashion, brings people together. So there's no reason why we should be saying prohibit this, but how do you as a parents ensure that to be the case? And I'll give you a quick example. I had a parent about a year ago who was struggling with their young son during the pandemic. And he's like, the only time his friends came over was when they wanted to use weed or smoke cannabis together. I said to the parent, did you allow this? He said, yes. It was the one time his friends were actually getting together. I said, how old were all those 4 kids? Under 21. I said, did you realize you just committed child abuse? That I could report you to CFS for endangering the lives of these other teenagers? And he laughed at me. He said, Dr. Fong, what are you talking about? It's just weed. It's not that big of a deal. I said, it's a Schedule I federally legal substance. It's 21 and under. I could, if I followed through, mandate this reporting because you gave and allowed other kids who are not your own a substance at 21 over. And he laughed and continued to think that I was wrong in my facts. That's the kind of prevention work that we need to talk about, where he, as a reasonable adult, thought cannabis was the solution to his son's anxiety and lack of connection. That was the problem, I thought, where parents need to recognize cannabis, gaming, and gambling should not be the solutions to problems. They could be part of the life, but they cannot be the only part. And I think, Hilarie, you probably see the same thing all the time, right? That's the thing. When people it's only one thing they do, and that's where the problems come.
Yeah. I often ask parents to visualize a 24-hour, a pie cut up into 24 hours and have them fill in that pie with all the healthy things that their child of any age needs. How much sleep do they need? How much time is it going to take them to take care of their responsibilities with school and schoolwork? How much time is it going to take them for showering and, staying clean, brushing their teeth, coming to the dinner table, and so on and so forth? And then, and that fills in the pie pretty thoroughly. And then they say to me, and then I'll say, okay, now there's maybe a little sliver of the pie left over. That's a sliver of the pie where they can, that's up within legal bounds. That's up to them to figure out how they're going to fill that time.
Yeah.
And so it's it's entertainment, and it's the last on the list of priorities, absolutely the last. And if you will make sure that your kid is filling in everything else in that pie, then you're going to have a kid who grows up in a healthy way, especially if part of that pie is connecting with family and friends. As you say, it is connection is the greatest insurance against addiction.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And there's a few things during the pandemic that I came to realize for myself and our own family is that the value of unstructured time free of electronics. But how difficult is it for every family in America to say, okay, for the next hour, we're going internet free. We're putting our phones aside.
Right.
All of us would have a difficulty in that. But we do know that unstructured time is what people need to daydream, to deal with boredom, to kind of start processing things. So that's why I think a lot of people really turn to walks, right? Walks without the phone. That's a great example of doing something that's unstructured. I also think we've gotten away for parents from the board games. I'm curious, Hilarie, have you seen this with some of your patients and family? They just don't play board games. And there's a difference between video games you play as a family versus and as our kids call old-fashioned games, like Monopoly and Risk and things like that. But during the pandemic, many families started to discover that again. And I think that should be on the menu, that old traditional family game night that doesn't involve an electronic. But these are not easy. These are hard because it's hard as a parent and family to introduce activities that people have never done before. So I started to do that with some families and say, you know what, why don't you start with 15 minutes of no phone time as a family? And it's not a punishment. And if you can't do 15 minutes, you start with 10 minutes. You can't do 10 minutes, you start with 5. And then that's where you start introducing some ideas. And I think that's a really great prevention tool.
And I think parents do understand, or we can help parents understand that they have to be good role models. If they want their kids to be using electronics in a way that is healthy, they themselves have to really have a good, hard, honest look at themselves.
Yeah.
And the other comment I want to make is that my experience is that when, especially around neurobiology of addiction, that if you educate kids of any age about what is actually going on in their bodies, in their brains, they are much more receptive to the idea that in order to be healthy, they've got to limit this, because most people want to have good brains that are working well. And if they understand how it interferes with that, be it the gaming, be it the marijuana, whatever it is, they're more receptive.
And I think this is an important time to recognize the science is getting stronger and stronger, that the younger you are when you use cannabis on a regular basis, you do unfortunately damage brain functioning. So you lose IQ points, you lose the ability to learn, you lose cognitive flexibility, all that stuff that you need as an adult. What we don't know is what happens with gaming and gambling, right, when you're young. What does that do to your cognitive abilities later on?
We're learning. There actually is a lot of research that's showing the damage.
The damage as well, again, from excessive use or early exposures from other things. So that's the story. And I think people, when they get to, again, they're like, well, how can cannabis do that? It's not unsafe. It's just weed. Again, high concentrated products. There's still a lot of, toxic substances packaged into some of these things. And the brain, when you're growing, when you're young, it's like, Play-Doh. It's like putty. It's very sensitive. It can bounce back super quick, but if you keep hitting it over and over and over with something that Mother Nature never really intended, eventually you're going to disrupt the wiring, the chemical functioning, and all that. The way I describe it for kids and families, it's like a tree. A fully grown tree will have a thick root, multiple branches with a lot of leaves and a lot of, connections. A tree that's disrupted in its growing pattern early on, maybe only half the branches grow out, or maybe a bunch of leaves don't fill in and you get a tree that's sparsely foliated. And I think that's the visual image I use a lot. Kids get that.
Mm-hmm.
They're like, well, I don't want a tree that has a couple branches that are snapped off. I want a thick, bunch of leaves. They absolutely get that.
Yeah.
I want to make a couple tie-ins to things you guys have talked about the importance of connection and healthy relationships and learning behaviors that help prevent addiction, and that gaming can fit within a healthy, balanced lifestyle. But you've also talked about what goes on during that game time is important as well. You know, if they're like, okay, this is my game time, and they sign on, and that 10-year-old is in a game with a bunch of adults playing unsupervised, the game might be age rated, one thing, but then the players, the content they're bringing in, and the nature of their conversations and whatnot, and their interactions, that's not rated. And if there's adults in there, you know, a parent might think, okay, would I let my 10, 12, 14, 15, 16-year-old leave the house with a group of adults I have never met, completely unsupervised by me, and hang out for 4 hours? Probably not. So why would you let them do that online? Right? There needs to be some boundaries about what types of games, some observation about what kind of mature content is going on in those games with the other players as well. Because that's where, like you guys are pointing out, they might be getting introduced to some of these more adult activities through that platform.
I love that you said that, and I like your way of getting the audience to think about that, because that is just so very true. We, in the real world, we understand we have to supervise our kids. We have to make sure we know who they're playing with, where they're hanging out, within reason. And so many people just are not recognizing that a game, Minecraft is a game that adults can play. Kids, all the kids are playing that, or Roblox, or whatever the current popular game is. And there are adults in playing those games. Some of those adults are using those games as a way to find their next victim, if they are abusers. But even if they're not, those kids can be exposed to some very inappropriate things. So parents need to remember that supervision has to extend to their children's online universes. Yeah.
And one of the areas of parenting in 2022 is participation. Yeah. I have so many parents that have never sat down with their young person to watch them play or to try and play these games. Part of the issue is because these games are so complicated, they're so fast.
And the parents are so bad.
Right. It's not like Fong or the ones that we grew up with. So the parents are like, you know what, forget it. And it's also, it's babysitter. So the parents are just, so relieved that, hey, at least they're not playing in the park unsupervised. I'd rather have my kid in my house playing unsupervised. And it's a reversal where it's interesting to me when I tell parents, sit down before you start judging these games, sit down with your son or daughter, watch them play, have your son or daughter play with them. And immediately there's discomfort on both sides.
Yeah.
The child's like, I don't want my parent to watch me. Right? Yeah. And the parent's like, I don't want to sit there. That's a waste of time. And someone has to commit. And if you want to do effective family dynamics and monitoring and regulation support, you have to get. I had a couple of cases of young kids who did not have gaming disorder. They were amazing young people. Their parents insisted they did because they spent all their time. And I asked what they wanted to do for a career. They wanted to pursue a career in gaming as a programmer. And the parents completely dismissed the idea of the video game industry as a legitimate business just because they didn't know about it. They just assumed that it was a complete waste of time. Didn't realize that video games are a $40 billion industry or whatever. So that world has changed, but parenting has not. and the tools of parenting that work, establishing clear expectation, participating in what your child is doing, being aware of what your child is doing, and saying no to activities that violate what you believe to be the house rules.
Mhm.
So another intersection, right, between cannabis, gaming, and gambling is money. So when children buy things online and the parent is unaware, whether they use the parent's Apple ID or credit card, should there be consequences? What generally happens? And so these are all the new world parts, and I've had a number of cases where the child spent hundreds of dollars, thousands of dollars on video games or on social casino games, and the parent was completely unaware. And when they discovered it, there was zero consequences.
Mhm.
So that's not a way of establishing, proper responsibilities. It's an enabling tactic, and for my message to parenting is not do better, but participate more.
Mhm.
And if you find that you're not, you better start to look at your own mental health. Maybe you have a depression, anxiety, or trauma yourself that's not allowing you to have a healthy attachment to your child.
So what you're saying really then reminds me of the struggle that I think families have, because parents so often feel just isolated. They feel like, I'm weird if I'm setting these boundaries for my kids, and I don't feel supported, and my kid feels isolated and weird, uh, and so forth. And again, getting back to this whole question of how do you change social norms, I think I think we all have to work very hard at helping. And again, I think schools could play like the central critical role here of creating a place where parents can get educated about marijuana and gambling and gaming, and through that work together to create together, based on the information they're being given, work together to come to some agreements about what are going to be the norms that we are going to agree on, so that our kids will not feel weird, but in fact will feel that they're part of a little community or a big community of other kids, other families, where this is normal to have of sensible boundaries around all of these things. And when that happens, the parents don't feel weird, the kids don't feel weird, and you start to see a shift. Again, it's like a new cultural norm that starts to develop.
Yeah.
And I would love to see that happen. And I think that one of the best ways and places for that to happen is with the schools. So anyway, I think it's very hard.
Oh, that's so interesting. We use different terms, but we're meaning the same things: boundaries, social norms, expectations, consistency, follow through. And I was just thinking about my own life. When our kids were young, we did a lot of like reading on baby books and preparing to be a parent. And then as they gotten older, there is no teenage manual that we were reading, and it was just kind of like fly by night sort of thing. But one of the things you're saying is so important, right? The schools don't necessarily do it. Where children get mentors,
Yeah.
that is the other major prevention tool we have here. And I think about the mentors in America that kids can access. It's going to be teachers, coaches, music teachers, folks in the church. And unfortunately, there's been, I think a lot of mistrust by a lot of adults about other adults mentoring your own kid. That's where something I'd like to see shifted. Because when kids have multiple mentors, not just my mom and dad, and when they get to be a teenager, I'm no longer a mentor to my teenage son. He's like, Dad, you don't know anything. But when he hears the same message from his hockey coach or from his boss at his where he works, and I'm like, I said the same thing, but he said it doesn't mean as much coming from you. It means more coming. And I think that's where, Hilarie, we're saying exactly that message. Adults have a role in multiple areas to do that. Parents definitely need to seek out more information on their own and not falsely believe what they think or what they think based on someone else telling them on social media or what they overheard in the PTA meeting.
And this is where I think there's such a need for public education, right? So messages, public education, that needs to be developed, and so that those coaches understand, and again, maybe it's the schools that play a central role here, so that the coaches understand the same thing that the parents understand, the same thing that the teachers understand, the same thing that the ministers and youth group leaders understand. It's like if everybody can be more or less on the same page,
Yep.
then the kids get the messages from where they need to.
I really appreciate that you two are really highlighting that there's no shame on parents for not really knowing the healthy boundaries and limits around these things. How would they know? There's no precedent for it yet, right? Gaming's been around a while, but there's no precedent for this established in our systems the way we have for other kinds of things. So I appreciate that, and I think you're right. I hope that with time the culture around this can change, and there'll be some sort of standard guidelines, more accessible, more available, more easy to find for parents. And I want to wrap us up with one last thing, which is for adults, because while of course youth are a huge focus, we want to prevent this from ever developing as much as possible. Adults, we don't want to leave them out of the equation either. But for them, all of these things are legal and accessible to them. They are running their own life, making their own choices, and determining for themselves what is healthy engagement for this. So what might be some tips or words of advice you might have for them to self-regulate and try to prevent these things from becoming problems in their life?
Well, I do think time and content matters. And so if we're talking about video games, what you are engaged with, video games are interactive. They are very, very immersive and powerful. And they powerfully influence how we feel and how we think. And therefore, to some extent, how we behave. And so if you are, so I really want to encourage people to look for pro-social experiences online rather than antisocial experiences online. There's also really good evidence that shows that, a couple of hours of playing a video game, if we just stick with that for the moment, is actually can be very beneficial. And there's no harm in that. That's moderation and abuse. But there's also, it's very, very clear from the research that if that time just creeps up and up and up, it means you're spending less and less time in all the other things that are needed to be well-regulated and living an adult, well-regulated, healthy life. And inevitably, that dysregulation that will follow from too many hours spent in front of a screen is going to lead to depression, anxiety, and just a worsening of mental health. So moderation is the key, and content matters.
That's very well said. I'll only add that it's simply I say to folks, if your engagement in cannabis, gaming, or gambling, if it makes your quality of life better, if it makes your life satisfaction better, you're probably doing it in a healthy way. If you use cannabis, gaming, or gambling as a way of trying to solve life's problems, as a solution to something bigger, a solution to my debt, a solution to my loneliness, a solution to my I hate my job, then it's not entertainment. Then it becomes something else. And a lot of times folks are like, yeah, but it works. Yeah, but it really, I like it. And And then they're entering this world of denial where they don't want to give up this very thing that they know temporarily gives them a little bit of an emotional band-aid. So the issue really isn't, don't do it. It's explore, but pay attention, be mindful. That's the big word that we all love. Be mindful of what it's doing to your body, your brain, and your mind. And so often, I think people do recognize it's unhealthy for the ones who have it, but it's the fear of how do I live without it? It's the fear of where do I go to get help? The fear that if I stop gaming or using cannabis, how do I manage the misery, the emotional pain? That's what holds people back. And I think people sometimes really struggle to say, well, where else can I find inspiration and a lot of positive feelings? And that's where it goes back. Very simply, I'll say it again. If these behaviors make your life worse, if they create problems, then it's not entertainment. It's something much deeper.
Mm-hmm. And I think if we want to circle back around to your kale and quinoa example, there's a reason that at the end of a bad day or when someone's feeling negative emotions, they're not craving kale and quinoa, right? The very reason that some of these substances and activities, they're effective at changing our mood and mental state is exactly the thing that makes them have the addictive potential. And so, yeah, well said. We want to be mindful of what exactly is our purpose using it and what is the effect and does it make us feel better for the moment and then we're having negative problems or outcomes from it in some way. If it's just entertainment, it shouldn't be causing any of these problems or side effects. Thank you. Anything else either of you would like to add or say before we close out today?
I was just what you were saying, Tana, just reminded me of a book that I'm making my way through that I'm loving, called Dopamine Nation. And Dr. Fong, you're probably familiar with that book, and it's just such a very good read, and a really helpful way, I think, if people would read it, of understanding how we have a whole economy that's really based on selling activities and things that are of high dopamine release, that create high dopamine release, and that those are the very things that are also very addictive, have the potential to be very, very addictive, and that, we're all in this culture that is, we're all surrounded by all of these opportunities to indulge in things that make us feel really, really good in the moment and can have some very significant consequences down the road, and that it's not at all easy to navigate living a healthy, well-balanced life in the face of this onslaught of all of these things that are being offered to us all the time. And again, that gets back to what Tim was talking about earlier, of the need for connection, the need for community, so that we feel that we're not alone as we try to navigate a landscape that's not easy to navigate.
Well said. Well said. And thank you both for being part of my community and connection. Appreciate it. And thank you for all of the amazing insight. This was like a packed hour of such great information on this topic. I really appreciate it. So thank you everyone who tuned in live or is watching afterward on demand. We hope it's helpful to you, and take care and stay safe.
Thank you. Bye-bye.